But it's led by the amazing Dan Huttenlocher, who I happen to have known for an extremely long time, since the mid-'80s when we were both students. So it's really nice that I get a chance to bring him here.
10 years old.
They're clapping that we were 10 years old.
We were child prodigies.
And believe it or not, Dan has the most amazing chair, because who knew this? You have a chair named after an 1894 alum. Can you believe that? So this chair for electrical engineering and computer science was first established in 1894, and Dan holds it. So that's pretty cool. He is a world-renowned researcher in AI and computer vision in particular, and he's been on computer vision since I met him. So that's pretty amazing. Understanding the challenges of looking at an image and making sense of it. And he wrote a book that's really fascinating. So we're going to have a chance, hopefully, to hear a little bit about it, The Age of AI and Our Human Future. So that was co-authored with Henry Kissinger and Eric Schmidt. So a really interesting set of co-authors. I wanted a little view into what your discussions were like.
Ask me a question.
All right, good. He's also worked in the startup world, led massive innovations at Cornell, which led to the creation of a new campus in New York City, and a lot of investment into the entrepreneurial ecosystem. And he was an early researcher at Xerox PARC, which is famous for computer scientists as a place where the future was invented and then dropped. But that was and there you worked with John Seeley Brown and all kinds of researchers from around the world. So I'm thrilled that Dan found time to come and talk to us this morning. Dan.
How does anyone live up to Anjali's introductions?
You're worth it.
I'm delighted to be here with you all, and I'm also very excited about your mission and what you're all doing together. So it's a privilege to be here. So I wanted to talk a bit about AI governance, but in order to talk about AI governance, we have to talk about what AI is, because I think we're all confused. The experts are confused. Anybody who tells you that they know what AI is, run and hide. But I think we do need to start to think collectively. The technology experts, the people who are using AI in education, the people who are using AI as entrepreneurs, in government, et cetera. And we all need to think about how it is that we're interacting with AI and what the governance challenges are. But I have to start with the what. So what is AI? Well, I'll give you some properties that I think are important here. So there's often a focus on specific technologies, deep learning, generative pre-trained transformers, which is what GPT stands for, et cetera. The specific technologies, I think, are much less relevant. What's more relevant is what the technology is used for, making decisions, making recommendations, making predictions, or creating content like text, images, and audio. Now, you should stop and think, well, that can't quite be right. We've done weather prediction for about 50 or 60 years now, and AI certainly wasn't mature enough. There was AI research back then. So there's another aspect to this, which is it's trained in order to perform a task, rather than requiring the very kinds of precise instructions that traditional software development requires. And this is enabled by machine learning. They used to be, when I was a graduate student, they were trained by people. Like literally, you would try to take expertise. Most of you are nowhere near old enough to remember expert systems. but it was always about training these systems. But now they learn on their own with machine learning. And that's a really fundamental advance. And what happens with machine learning applied in these kinds of application domains is you get outcomes that are imprecise, that are adaptive to the situation, and where the outcome is sometimes emergent. It's not what the people who developed the system necessarily would have anticipated or predicted. And those things together are what make it feel human-like. because these are characteristics we think of as human, not software, right? Software is rigid and inflexible and annoying, and you want it to do this, and it does some other thing, and you can't really. So it's very different, very human-like. So this is the way I encourage people to think about AI, not so much in terms of specific technologies, but in terms of how we use it and what its characteristics are. Now, one of the things I think is very important because of the explosion of AI on the landscape in the last couple of years is it's been in your daily life for almost a decade if you use the internet regularly. So in 2015, Google took their search engine and converted it from the information retrieval types of software that it was using, very carefully hand-tuned, hand-coded software, to using machine learning. No big fanfare, no big announcement, lots of sort of, what should I call it? Heated debates inside the company about, when to convert and whether to convert. But really, this is what has enabled modern search engines, was that switch in 2015. So that's approaching a decade ago. And then in 2020, DeepMind, a UK company that Google acquired, developed machine learning for navigation route finding, and that drives Google Maps. And now all navigation route finding uses machine learning. That's how it does a reasonably good job of predicting how long it's going to take you to get somewhere and what route you should follow. And then in 2022, we had OpenAI and generative AI and ChatGPT and realistic images with DALL-E, which took a little longer to get recognized as widely as ChatGPT. And everything went crazy. But that is many years into the widespread use of AI. And of course, as Anjali said, way back in the 1980s, and in fact, the very earliest thinking about machine learning goes back to Alan Turing and some other people in the late 1950s. So I like to think about AI as a funhouse mirror. It's a distorted view of the world. It's some other perception of what's going on around us than the one that we have with our own eyes and other senses and minds. So this, when you have an altered view, that's not necessarily good or bad. It's just different. And so we really need to think about AI, sort of carefully, attentively when we're using it. But two things that tend to happen with something that distorts the world in ways we're not used to is people either get very, very cautious or they get very, very bold. And you're certainly seeing that in the AI arena, right? People are just like, I don't want to use this stuff at all. It might do something bad. To people who are like, potential shortcomings be damned. I'm going to launch this thing without actually thinking it all the way through. I think it's very important to be in the middle of that. And I'm going to try in this to give you some guidelines, then we can have some Q&A. Just like one of the really important things is that depending on how it's trained, AI can make decisions or produce outputs that make human processes better and fairer, or that reinforce the errors and the bias. Humans are very far from perfect. We make lots of errors. We have biases in what we do. But it can do either. And I think, depending on what you read, if you read something in, maybe a more business-oriented view of the world, you mainly hear about the former. And if you read things in some more socially concerned and informed place, you mainly hear about the latter, as if that was all that was happening in both cases. But it's both. And so one way I think it's useful to think about machine learning-driven AI is it's an amplifier of human behavior. And amplifiers amplify the good and amplify the bad. So what we need to think about is, there are great examples of, machine learning being used to actually make pretrial detention in the judicial system both safer and fairer, of, improving hiring outcomes in terms of both equity and, longevity of the people who are hired. It's medical treatment, et cetera, but also the opposite. Not just how these systems are trained, but it's also how they're used. So there's often a tendency with AI to try to use it as an expert. But what I'm going to argue through most of this is that it's much better to use it as a thought partner, as something where it's humans and machines working together. And I'll try to illustrate that. All right, so AI is not human, but it can appear to be. This is just, going way back to Greek mythology. Like, there's lots of, humanity has long thought about things that are humanoid, in this case created by the Greek gods, but not the Greek gods themselves. But it's very important to think about the fact that AI is trained on human behavior, but just sort of the outcomes of it. And human behavior is not just intellect, yet AI is much more about intelligence and intellect. So you would think about things like, our human values, our motivations, our emotions, morality, judgment. Those are things that you see kind of indirectly in human behavior, but not so directly. So AI doesn't really have those things, but those things are very important to the kinds of outcomes we want to see in the world. And worse yet, AI can simulate these things in ways that look like it might have them. So I think one of the other things to just recognize, it's almost unavoidable that we anthropomorphize AI. Like many of us anthropomorphize our pets. I have certain family members who I tease about this relentlessly. It's just, things that we interact with, it's natural to do that. But I think here particularly so. And you may read about what's called AI alignment, the alignment of AI algorithms, machine learning with human values and human behavior. And in my view, that's nothing more than a stopgap. And in fact, the stopgap that we should recognize is one. So it's great to have AI better aligned with human values. It's less likely to make the kinds of mistakes that would come from amoral behavior or other things. But don't let it lull you into thinking that it actually has those human values.
How is an alignment measured now?
So alignment is measured now generally using techniques where human beings look at the output of AI in response to inputs or prompts that might generate outputs which we wouldn't like to see, and they score it. Yeah. So right now it's completely done with humans, and then they give often feedback to the systems. There's something called RLHF, reinforcement learning is a particular type of machine learning, and the HF is human feedback. So what happens is humans interact with the system, they score it, but they also often give explicit feedback. Instead of saying what you said, you should say something like this. And that's why you'll often see that, so when these chatbots first came out, right, there were a lot of news articles about people interacting with them in ways that, the chatbot would tell, somebody to divorce their spouse or other things like that, kind of strange. And so these alignment techniques were used to help correct that, but they're sort of a Band-Aid. And so there's usually a way around them if you clever humans can continue to interact with the system and figure out a way around the alignment. And that's because underneath, there really isn't a moral system, for example. There's just some tuning to make it look more like it has a moral system. It's a good thing, but just not enough. All right. So now this kind of gets to the theme of the book that Anjali mentioned that I had the privilege of writing with Kissinger and Schmidt. So if you look all the way back to the Age of Enlightenment, when we moved from a world where people largely understood the world through faith to a world where people largely understood the world through a combination of faith and human reason. And what we're now seeing is a third thing with machine learning-driven AI that is neither faith, at least I hope it's not. If we start believing in the AI God, that's going to be really interesting, but I'll stipulate that it's different from faith, and it's definitely different from human reason. So we have this new kind of intellect that's adding a new way to understanding the world. And if you think about sort of what happened in sort of the age where human reason started to become treated by many as equal to faith as a valid way of understanding the world, those are time periods with lots of upheaval. because they're just fundamental questions about what it means to be human when you have some completely different way of looking at the world. So it's going to cause uneasiness no matter what, because it's such a fundamental change. And one of our tasks, and that's why I said at the beginning, I think it's very important, it's not just about technologists, it's about everybody in this room. How do we distinguish the uneasiness that comes with a change of this magnitude from things that are real risks that need to be addressed? And that's where governance, broad participation, broad understanding comes into play. So let me give an example. It's one that exists in a lot of technologies, but I think it's much more profound in this case. So AI can be enlightening and enfranchising, or conversely, it can misinform, deep fakes, all of this stuff that's out there these days, and disempowering. This difference is not new. So if we think about kind of all of the history of mechanization back to the early days of industrialization, mechanization can increase human agency or decrease it. So if you think about assembly line work and sort of a human as literally a cog in a bigger mechanized system, that's relatively disempowering, although it might have brought a reasonable paycheck to people. It's not empowering beyond that. But if you think about things like power tools that allow you as an individual to do what you want more effectively, or as a group of individuals, it's very empowering. So the same kind of thing happens with AI, and here's just sort of an example. The driver navigation that I was talking about that we're all using, it can be very disempowering if you're a ride-share driver and you're expected to follow the route that the system is giving you, versus you're an individual who it's just an added data point. It's another piece of information. You can look at the route that it's giving and you can say, okay, that's one more piece of information, but it doesn't understand that 5 feet in front of me, I see a wreck that just happened. And so I'm going to ignore it and go some other way and let it recalculate. So those are things, and there are reasons that in these ride-sharing contexts where the customer, the passenger, often doesn't know what's a good route and what's not, that the driver is expected to follow the system route rather than something that might not be good for the passenger. But it's quite disempowering for the driver. So one of the big things that a number of us have been thinking about at MIT growing out of this sort of view of the world I've been sharing is, really thinking about AI as a collaborative technology rather than as a substitution technology. And actually here at MIT, you can go back to 1960, right? So Turing's early work was really around that time period. He published a paper with the catchy title of Man-Computer Symbiosis, right? So, but Lick was a faculty member here at MIT and still in the 80s when I was a student. And it's very different from this dominant view of AI replicating human behavior, which if you saw this movie about Turing's life called The Imitation Game, right? It's about sort of AI imitating humans, replicating humans. Lick's view was that humans and intelligent machines together should be better than either one of them alone. Better than humans alone, but also better than the machines alone, rather than just sort of trying to make the machine better and better and better on its own, which is kind of the loop we're in right now. And when you think about safety and human values and governance and things that, as I argued before, AI really isn't going to capture, at least not any AI we know today, it really underscores the importance of collaborative uses of AI together with humans. In any high-risk area, healthcare, jurisprudence, hiring, banking, education, things that have huge consequences for humans, I think this is very important. All right, so now to governance. Long intro. Don't worry, the governance is like halfway through the talk, through the slide deck. It's not, because I just think without that context, very hard to think about governance. So one of the things, we have a set of people at MIT who've been working, and it's across computer science, AI researchers, the Sloan School, economics, political science. It's a broad group, not just technologists, but people who are pretty informed about technology, thinking about governance. And given that there was a big flurry of activity in the US in the last summer about possible congressional legislation, we did a lot of work on some policy briefs for the US Congress, but I think that these, and they're available publicly. So this is a little bit rooted in that, so there's probably somewhat of a US-centric view here inadvertently, just because that was the backdrop for it, but I think these are broader principles. So one of the things we argued is, don't try to formulate some new separate policies for AI as if AI was some new separate being that we need to somehow think about regulating. It's not. Start with current regulations. And in particular, if human behavior is regulated in some domain, it's probably a high-risk domain, right? Why in most places do we regulate things like medicine and finance and law and, and the judicial system, et cetera? It's because those human decisions and human behaviors have huge effects on other people. So our argument was start there and, make sure that AI is not somehow some free pass around the regulations that are in those domains. And if you think about the early days of chatbots, that was a little bit the case, right? You could go ask chatbots for medical advice. They would pretend to be a doctor. They were perfectly happy to do that. Not such a good idea. I wouldn't depend on that medical advice if I were you. So if you have separate policies for AI, the potential for inconsistency with policies that govern humans is really problematic. And this is in both directions. You could be simultaneously over-regulating and under-regulating AI relative to the way we regulate people. So we really think this needs to be used as an extension of existing regulation and governance. And we think it's important to try to develop policy approaches that encourage human agency and dignity, because this thing can be used in ways that help facilitate or not, and that human AI collaboration is a very good way of doing that rather than standalone AI. Not to mandate it, but just to try to facilitate. There are places where standalone AI is fine, right? If it's, the kind of thing that would have been done by, a standalone device in an assembly line or something, and you replace it with it, fine. But as you start thinking about these things that influence humans' lives so much, we think this is important to encourage. So another key thing about governance is you have to think about norms and responsibility. If you just try to put some governance structure in place without aligning with what the society is doing, my favorite example in the US is the Prohibition era, ban alcohol, but the people don't really follow that, and what do? You enable lots of organized crime, kind of basically the outcome. So there really have to be shared norms. But the thing about technology is that shared norms develop slowly. So I don't know, somehow in this group we got into looking at the development of things like electrification. So these are early electric toasters. I think this one's in the UK. It had like a huge plug on the end of it, so it looks like a UK plug. But there's a photo of an actual one. It's hard to imagine not electrocuting yourself with this toaster. But over time, as people got more used to electricity and its dangers and what it could do, the design of these things evolved in ways that protected people while still being functional. And people learned that they needed that kind of protection. It's a little frustrating when something gets stuck in your toaster today compared to getting it out of something like that. But we're willing to live with the trade-offs. So it started to be what we called the fork in a toaster problem, which we think is very applicable in the AI arena. We have no societal norms for when are you using something in an unintended manner, and kind of caveat emptor, like you should be more careful and more responsible for what you're doing, versus you're using it in the way that sort of was expected, and whoever produced it should have some real responsibility for that. And those kinds of norms and new technologies develop slowly, years, decades. But this technology is moving very quickly. So that's just a challenge. So when we look at things like responsibility, which is an important part usually of governance approaches, they really should be done in the context of sort of best practice guardrails, starting to develop well understood legal responsibilities, And this all sounds sort of hopeless for this quickly moving new technology, but I don't think it actually is. So I was shocked by the following. The big generative AI companies, the ones that sell generative AI services, for their paying customers, so they have free versions, that's your problem, but for their paying customers, if those systems generate content where somebody brings a copyright infringement case against, so I use, OpenAI or Microsoft's AI or whatever to create some content, I distribute it, somebody sues me for copyright infringement. So any copyright suit or judgment against me when I'm a paid user of those tools, Microsoft will indemnify me as a company. Now, what's so shocking about that to me is if you think about the software industry and their normal approach, which is a 300-page long end-user license agreement in 2-point font, which you have to click to be able to use the thing. And essentially what it says is it's all your fault. So in every way that they could think of. So this is a very big change for the software industry compared to their normal approaches. This is something that they recognize is different from conventional software. So it's interesting. Not saying it's easy and it's obvious, but it's not impossible. So I did want to talk for a minute about just security and world order, because I think the pre-World War I era in Europe and in the sort of Atlantic theater offers a huge warning. So that was where there are a lot of rapid advances from industrialization. And they led to huge changes in military capability and particularly military speed. But diplomacy did not change. And military doctrines did not change, just the technology. And so what you saw happen in particular was that literally you could put a railroad down overnight, which meant that you could get materiel and troops to the front line very quickly. And all of diplomacy assumed that it took a long time for a conflict to evolve unless it was already a flashpoint, because it just takes time to get stuff there. And same thing with military planning. So things literally exploded very, very rapidly in ways that nobody expected. So AI's capacity for autonomy, its different form of intelligence from human intelligence, there's a whole bunch of new incalculability that's extremely important to both diplomacy and military doctrines. So that's just a very important set of things that everybody should have in mind as a backdrop. I think, at least many of the countries with very large defense forces are very aware of this. Okay, so oversight of AI systems. They tend to be black box, they tend to be complicated. There's a lot of effort to sort of talk about explainability and interpretability. You can already tell by my tone of voice, I'm a little bit skeptical. I think they're likely to remain difficult to understand. And again, this is not that these efforts aren't good and important, but am I interpretable to you? Not so much. You have to judge me on my behavior and on the ways I explain my behavior to you. But you don't know that that was actually what was going on inside my head. And the capabilities of AI are such that I think that's a better analogy than conventional technology. We're not going to get to, the after incident report in a plane crash that they can, say this bolt failed. It's not that kind of technology. So it's going to be inherently limited, I believe, and more analogous to human action, where we have to sort of look at what the thing is doing and what it was designed to do. So this does mean that in this world where there's training, it's very important that we train these systems in ways that we understand something about the training and what they were trained on. Because unreliable information can be blended in complex ways in with more reliable information in the training process. So a focus on the training, on the learning is extremely important. One way that we deal with complex systems that involve a lot of people, where we can't understand the outcomes very well, is auditing and monitoring, and I think that's very applicable here. We use it for a lot of high-risk activities, right? So you often think of audit as financial audit initially, but there are a lot of audits that are used, right? I mean, in most places, the safety of, of a hospital and other things is overseen and audited quite a bit. And so there are two types. Ex-ante audits, which help weed out problems prior to use. So things like in pharmaceuticals and in medical devices in most places, there's a lot of testing before the thing can go out into the market. But the results in practice can vary. And particularly with AI, because it's trained on some data set with some distribution of data that may differ from the distribution of data in real use, ex-ante audits alone for AI are not sufficient. Look, we've been finding out they're not that sufficient in the medical world also, because the population on which you test a medication or a medical device can differ from where it's used. So I think part of what AI is uncovering is a lot of problems elsewhere, even in non-AI things. And then ex-post audits are the things that you do after the fact. And it's a combination of these two forms of audit that I think are going to be very important in AI. All right, so I want to now come back to something exciting, because this has kind of been all the how do we? So I think that to me, one of the things I'm most excited about AI and machine learning is what we learn from machine learning, we as human beings in our own understanding of the world, and how we educate. So if you look at the AlphaZero system, which DeepMind developed a number of years ago now, it learned how to play chess from self-play. The system played itself. It essentially knew nothing beyond the rules of chess, very little additional information. Whereas all chess programs before that had been trained on all previous chess play, right? The great thing about chess as a learning domain is the chess community kind of records every interesting game and has big books of them, and so it's a really great training set. AlphaZero wasn't given any of that. And what happened was it yielded completely new approaches to the game. Now, look, new approaches to the game could have been something that didn't work well, but these new approaches actually beat all the other chess programs that were out there. But they also gave humans new insight into the nature of the game. They changed how people play, including the grandmasters, the experts in the game. They revealed properties of chess and the strategies that humans had developed literally over a millennium or more that people just hadn't understood. Okay, chess is a game, but there are lots of places where this ability of systems that aren't just learning from human previous behavior, but are learning from other properties of the world, can reveal to us things that we haven't been able to discover on our own. So AI can learn from data about human activities. That's what I was talking about in saying limitations of things like looking, our systems making things better or worse if they're just amplifying what we do. But they can also learn from data about natural phenomena or from simulation like this where the system played itself. And those are particularly places where there's huge opportunity for discovery of things that our human intelligence way of looking at things hasn't found yet. So I'm really excited about that potential. And I just thought I'd mention one area, which is life sciences, where scientific discovery is important for all of our lives and our next generations after, children, grandchildren, et cetera. So back in ancient history in machine learning land in 2021, so 3 years ago, Science Magazine picked as the breakthrough of the year the ability to predict the 3D structure of any protein just from its amino acid sequence. And this is when so much of pharmaceutical development depends on protein conformation. What shape is a protein taking? What can actually bind to it in terms of medications and so forth. In the last 3 years, this has transformed life sciences wildly more than that 2021 breakthrough of the year ever envisioned. It's completely turned huge parts of the life sciences on their head. And new machine learning methods have been developed that are much, much, much more effective than what was developed at that point in 2021. So it's just a place that's, you don't read about it as much because it's not a chatbot in front of your face, but it's a place where the advances have been at least as fast as chatbots. And so now generative AI underlying chatbots, this is probably going to even revolutionize more rapidly the understanding of proteins. There's an area called metagenomics where instead of having an amino acid sequence of a particular protein, you just take basically a whole stew of stuff and drop it in the system, and it just tries to sequence everything that's there. It gets snippets of stuff. It confuses things with each other. It doesn't. But these new generative AI techniques are actually able to make sense out of that kind of complexity, which is, I think, going to be even more transformative. There's also a huge amount of work in autonomous chemical discovery going on now with AI systems that can help people discover new chemicals. And not just discovery of chemicals with properties we want, but also just how to synthesize those chemicals, which is extremely important. If AI discovers a chemical no human would discover, but no human can synthesize it, you're in trouble. So not very useful. And then increasingly in clinical practice, it's proving useful. So these are the kinds of things that excite me. So hopefully my message from this and thinking about governance is the broader understanding of what AI and machine learning mean for us, and that we can build a better future with AI, but it's not automatic. And it's up to everyone in this room and everyone who's using AI or potentially using AI. It's not just up to technologists. And therefore, it is up to all of us to learn how AI might make a difference, both positively and negatively, in our own area of expertise. And to think about governance, not in terms of AI as some separate thing to govern, but governance in the form of this is some amplifier of human capabilities, both good and bad. We have to think about governance in conjunction with how we govern human activity. So with that, hopefully we have some time for questions.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Dan. Questions from the room? Indra. I don't know if you have maybe stand up and talk loudly. Yeah, thanks, Indra.
Hi, good morning. We're still in morning time. Good morning. Thank you so much for your presentation. Oh, thank you so much. My name is Indra. I'm from with WADA Foundation from Indonesia. So we're a nonprofit organization that works with marginalized communities. So we're very far from this world where we're sort of, we're working towards bridging that digital divide and, sort of helping give access, increasing access to technology for a lot of these communities. And so I wanted to ask on if there were recommendations or guidelines in place on how to train these new tools, or if that was dependent on policies in place, like data protection laws in Europe. And so that was my question. Thank you so much.
So that's a very complicated question. I'm going to try to give it's a great question, and it's a problem that it's so complicated to answer it. But first, let me say something about bridging the digital divide, which is that these technologies are developing and becoming applicable rapidly enough that if you think about the era back, where people were trying to, still put landline telephones and communication devices into countries that had no infrastructure, but more developed countries already had cell phones. And luckily, we kind of got ahead of that, not necessarily by planning, but sometimes by planning, to say, wait a minute, putting all this copper in the ground, it's expensive and crazy, and just sort of skip the technology generation. I think because a lot of the AI technologies are much more usable by people who are not technologically sophisticated and literate, there's going to be another opportunity to skip a technology generation similar to just sort of moving straight to wireless communications in many parts of the world without building out the communications infrastructure that was in the more developed economies. So I think we're not there yet, but we will be there. And then I think there's a huge governance challenge there, which comes to your question around sort of the training, and which is that if these systems are solely trained in a different part of the world where the human behavior and the norms are different, it's going to reflect that and not what's in your society. And that's problematic in many, many, many ways. So I think it's very important to start to build, and some people are starting to look at this and think about this, to start to build consortia of places that are looking at what kind of data can they have access to, and what kinds of data governance and data privacy kind of regulations do they want to have that will enable the training of systems that are more appropriate for their population. And in Indonesia, you don't have this challenge, but places with small populations are going to have to team up with someplace else that's also like-minded, because these systems do use a lot of data to train. So a place with a very small population is going to have to, yes, not think only for themselves, because they probably won't get the kind of performance out of these systems that they need. I also think we're at a point right now that you should be planning beyond, which is that it's extremely expensive right now to train and to operate these systems. But the cost is going to go way down on exactly the same kind of curves that we've seen with all digital technology, of just sort of rapid exponential decline in the cost. And what we're already seeing is the use, what's called the inference stage of these things, is starting to happen on cell phones instead of on big cloud data centers. So that's already happening. And so I think the use will get cheaper quite quickly, actually. So hopefully I gave a bit of a guideline there.
Nice. We're going to get an online question, then go to Paolo, and then, all right, and Christina, and then Melchior.
So the online question is, you mentioned ex post auditing, but for AI, who is responsible for and how do you impose fines on AI?
So some individual or organization is operating the AI. They're responsible. I think any governance that somehow assumes that AI can have responsibility would be a huge mistake. So in most countries that I'm aware of, for example, just as a simple illustration, but I think is exactly in the right direction, AI cannot be granted a patent for inventing something. Patents are the result of human creative activity. The flip side of that is AI is not in control of itself. It would be saying a 3-year-old should be responsible for what they're doing. So the deployment of that has to come with responsibility.
Like a 3-year-old. All right. Yeah.
And even if it talks like a college-educated person, it's probably not even a 3-year-old in some ways. So,
thank you very much. I have a question I'm an ex-financial regulator economist. So you said that if human activity is regulated, then the AI should be regulated too. My question is the following. I think the financial crisis of 2008 showed that the underlying regulatory frameworks, so the market failure frameworks, are not...
I'm looking at Andrew Lowe. It's a good question, but we may both answer it, even though he's
basically,
speaking.
I was working at the regulator post-financial crisis, and we were drafting approach to economic regulation. And what we learned is that the governance frameworks are still not that capable or people with dealing with complexity and risks arising from complexity. And I don't think that issue has actually been solved. So if we're saying your existing underlying frameworks through which you think through the risks are still appropriate, isn't there a big gap that we're not thinking about those? And well, is there this gap? I think there is one. And then the second question is who could actually address this gap?
Yep. So I think there are gaps everywhere, and they're different scale in different places. But I would argue that to just try to regulate AI in the abstract, you're just fooling yourself. Because at least if you know what these systems do and don't do in the current environment, the regulatory systems do and don't do in the current environment, and you start to think about bringing machine learning-driven algorithms into the process there, you're building on some understanding of that domain. And the notion that there's somehow some domain-independent understanding of what AI will do is just, it's not true. I mean, I know, so the pushback we often get when we talk about this sort of domain by domain is, well, that's too complicated, we have to just regulate AI. But the just regulate AI is wildly more complicated than starting domain by domain, but that's starting with the current regulation in the domains. It's not saying that's the end point. So part of it is to identify gaps, to start to fill those in, but it's filling it in an intelligent way for the domain. Now, in financial markets in particular, I would say that the algorithmic trading challenges for market stability are really, they're already a pretty good model, I believe, for what machine learning driven algorithms bring there. Because there's already a huge amount of algorithmic stuff that's sort of more hand-tuned. And it's sort of like when Google switched in 2015 from their hand-tuned search engine to the machine learning one. The people using those need to recognize that they don't understand the potential downsides as well, but they didn't understand the downsides of the traditional algorithmic trading that well either, as we've found out. So this is just a constant interaction between the regulators and the people using the algorithms, and I think that is better going to be handled in sort of extending current frameworks. But I don't know if Andrew wants to jump in.
Yeah, go for it.
Yep.
Can we give a mic to Andrew?
I don't want to take time away from Dan's presentation. I'm going to cover that in my talk.
Okay, perfect.
Thank you. I agree with you.
If you were going to disagree, we should have the debate here. But
I'd also add that given that we have universities here and listening online, part of the charge to us is to figure out what we bake into our training of potential future financial regulators and bankers and finance execs and so on. So the education part needs to be upgraded.
that I totally agree with.
Paulo from Brazil,
So,
which I forgot to mention.
yeah.
Tour around the world. So we are thrilled that you're here.
Paulo Nussensweig, quantum physicist from the University of São Paulo in Brazil, currently provost for research and innovation. There's a lot to take from what you said, which goes way beyond governance. Actually, one of the things you mentioned about interpretability, I think, is related to predictability. And I wanted to make a comment that as a quantum physicist, I think that the uncertainty there is different from inherent uncertainty, which we have in quantum theory. The approach to unraveling nature, understanding, this in AI is all deterministic. We're still at that level. It is deterministic. Now, it may be, because there's huge complexity and nonlinearity, it may be akin to deterministic chaos, which obviously makes predictability difficult, but it's philosophically, it's different from inherent uncertainty. I want to make another comment, and / question related to governance, because I think we should have ethics committee requirements to work with AI. In the end, this is all experimenting with humans. And we have very strict ethical considerations in biology when we do any kind of human experimentation, right? AI, in the end, is experimenting with humans. So, in a way, as universities, as academics, as policy informers, right, we should bring up the fact that we are experimenting with humans. Now, I don't really know how to do this because Pandora's box is already wide open. How do we somehow come back to understanding that what we're doing, has profound implications on humans, and therefore there are ethical considerations that we would really need.
Yep. So I'll take the second one, although I do have something to say about the first one, but maybe that's an offline thing. So one of the key parts of the Schwarzman College of Computing mission is what we call the social and ethical responsibilities of computing, where we're developing curricula that can integrate in with teaching in various disciplines across MIT that look at social and ethical considerations around computing more broadly, but it's largely around use of AI. But look, even if I use linear regression, if I use linear regression as a mechanism to like predict whether people should get bail or not, I'd argue that the ethical issues there are probably even worse than with an AI algorithm, because you can just point to why that's a really bad model of making that kind of prediction. So I think in general, those are important issues. One of the things that we're doing is looking at both a combination of kind of standalone subjects that look at the ethical issues and integrating material into other subjects. Because completely standalone runs into a challenge. Like, I think most business schools teach ethics, right? But it's a, it's a small thing, and it doesn't come up in the rest of the curriculum that much. And so, you can argue, how much impact is that really having on longer term thinking? So we've been doing things that really try to integrate in with, in a computer science class, the actual code people are writing. In a machine learning class, natural language processing class, the decisions that they're making about, how they're thinking about the training issues around a large language model. So that is something that we think is extremely important. That's still an experiment underway. And as you can probably all imagine, given your day jobs, it's not easy to integrate more material into a class that's already 100% crammed full of stuff. And so this is something that's been a long sort of set of discussions and negotiations over the last 3 or 4 years, but we're seeing more and more of this integrated material, which I think is a super important piece.
Yeah. We only have time for one last Melchior. Do you have your hand up? And make it quick.
Hi, Melchor from Mexico. The word governance implies some kind of asymmetry of power, of control, and universities by nature are these uncontrollable beasts. I mean, and faculty and students, they do not want rules or regulations. How do you enforce?
Especially at this university.
Yes, I saw the protest yesterday. But the thing is that how do you actually make governance with written policies enforceable? Because actions need to have consequences. And how to, in this moving field where generative AI is moving like this, how do you actually write something in black and white that can be useful for all the parties involved? And that does not involve pushback from faculty and students.
So in the MIT context, we've been starting to do this, but we're a very decentralized place. So most of it is to try to give guidance to various schools and departments about how they view this. But I would say, for example, there's pretty uniform agreement at MIT that representing something written by a system rather than by yourself as your work is academic fraud. Now, look, we've never been that good at detecting academic fraud, as we know, right? Students get term papers written for them by other human beings. But at least setting the values and having the same kind of enforcement mechanisms that we do for other academic fraud. We're also working very hard, like I said, to try to, so that's sort of the stick. I'd say most of what we've been doing is on the carrot front, which is trying to support faculty with financial support, extra TAs, resources, et cetera, who are interested in integrating things about social and ethical considerations around computing and machine learning and AI into their classes. And there, actually, the pull from the students is substantive. So And our faculty, one of the great things about MIT, in my opinion, is the faculty really do view themselves as their teaching is important, and that what the students want to learn is an important component of that. So we're getting pretty good uptake from students also, from faculty also, because of the student sort of pressure in that direction. But it just takes time. Changing curricula is not fast. But I'd say we're mainly in the carrot phase right now.
Another carrot we have is MIT-wide conversations about AI. We've had Gen AI Week, which is a full week of events dedicated internally within MIT to AI. And we've had Festival of Learning, which was in January, which Open Learning hosts, also focused on AI, talks and kind of big tent events that also kind of help provide the impetus for people to get involved, and not consign it to the domain of CS or CSAIL or Schwartzman, but to realize we're all there. And that's been pretty cool. Like we had a musician and an artist at the Gen AI Week, and it's really helpful for us to kind of make sure the tent is really big. The other thing for our members is tomorrow we have 2 hours with Rodrigo Verdi, who's been orchestrating a community of practice at the Sloan School for all faculty on ways to embed AI and into their teaching. So we'll get a chance to do a deep dive with one person who's leading the charge in the school with a huge number of students. So I think that will be really interesting.
I would add one last thing, just because there's stuff you can go look at if you're interested. So we also had a generative AI impact papers call across all of MIT. Did you mention that before?
No,
okay.
no, I didn't.
Oh.
Tell them.
So we had a generative AI impact papers call issued by the president and the provost across all of MIT. And so that was generative AI in pretty much every domain. The review of that was led in the College of Computing by my deputy dean and myself, and we had a big faculty review committee. So there were, 25 or 30 papers in the first round, which have now been published by MIT Press in an online volume. So you can get it if you just, search for MIT generative AI impact papers. And there's a second smaller volume still in the works. So altogether, there'll be somewhere between 40 and 50 of these.
And the Pillar Collaborative also with the funder offering to support PhD students in research relating to AI. But now, you've already built up excitement about Andy Lowe.
As you should.
I know. Thank you so much, Dan.
Well, thank you very much, Professor Huttenlocher, for the excellent talk. And there were so many quotable quotes that I jotted down in my notes, but there's one thread that I'd like to pull out that had to do with AI and human alignment, and that the idea that underneath all of it there isn't a moral system. And I'd like to just let that sit for a second as we then introduce our next speaker, Professor Andrew Lowe. Professor Lowe is, well, I can attest that, in fact, we were not housemates in Cambridge like Anjali and Dan Huttenlocher, so you'd be interested to know that, in the 1980s, I should say. But Professor Lowe is the Charles E. and Susan T. Harris Professor of Finance and the Director of Laboratory for Financial Engineering at the MIT Sloan School of Management. His research spans 5 areas: evolutionary models of investor behavior, adaptive markets, artificial intelligence and financial technology, healthcare finance, measuring the financial implications of impact in investing, and financial engineering applications for funding hard tech innovation. You also see some of his work recently published in, Anjali mentioned Gen AI Week. Professor Lowe presented during that week back in January, I believe it was. Was November? All right, back in November. and then recently published a piece in MIT's paper series around generative AI. So with all of that, I welcome Professor Lowe.
So I'd like to start by thanking Anjali and the entire JWell team for inviting me to be here with all of you today, and thank all of you for coming. Obviously, a number of you came from a very long way to be here, and we really appreciate your being with all of us. Just give me a second so I can plug this in and get going. So at first, when I was preparing the talk, I was thinking, what should I talk about? Because there are obviously lots of aspects of AI that one could discuss with regard to education. And we obviously use it here as a tool. We've been working on it from the research perspective. And the question is for all of you, what would be of most interest? I didn't think finance would be that subject. But to the point that was made by Dan and others, I think you need to see an application in order to understand exactly how the components actually work. And so that's what I want to do today, is to talk about AI more broadly, but then focus on the possibility of a specific application in finance, and then you can think about how it applies to other aspects. For some reason, my laptop is not cooperating, so let me just give it one more try. And here we go. Let's see, this looks promising. Yeah, I was told to keep it. Let me just try to restart it. I don't know. This is. So let me begin, while this is rebooting, let me tell you a little bit about what I'm going to be focusing on. So my area of finance involves a number of different aspects of human behavior. And one of the things that I've been focusing on over the course of the last maybe 10 years or so is the idea of dealing with loss aversion. It turns out that there are a number of different behavioral anomalies that psychologists and behavioral economists have documented. And probably the most significant set of biases have to do with losing money of various different sorts. We're quite irrational about that. And part of that irrationality stems from, believe it or not, physiological aspects, the so-called fight or flight syndrome. And I can go on and describe to you all sorts of biological evidence that they're connected. But let me just skip to the bottom line for the financial markets, which is that when we're faced with losses, we tend to act in ways that will be ultimately detrimental to our financial health and wealth. And an example of that is the financial crisis. I remember giving a talk about the financial crisis a number of years ago, and this was maybe 5 years after 2008. And I was talking about the fact that we need to deal with these various different behavioral biases in a more productive way. So one of the attendees, a former student of mine, in the money management world, came up to me after the talk and said, "Professor Lowe, I really loved your comments about financial loss, and I'd love to get your advice. Because during the beginnings of the financial crisis, when the market went down, I decided to pull all my money out and put it in treasury bills. And it turned out that it worked beautifully. I saved myself probably a 20 or 30% loss given where I decided to pull out." And I said, "That's great. Well, what advice do you need from me?" And he said, "Well, it's been 5 years. Do you think it's time to get back in the market?" And that's the problem. The problem is that we don't react to losses very well. It might be perfectly rational for us to get out of the market, but the difficulty is, the difficulty is now to know when we get back in. So this paper that I wrote about the so-called freak-out factor is exactly trying to understand this idea of panic selling. So let me give it out. Let me give it a spin and just give out an example and see how well you do in dealing with loss. So imagine that I confront you with an investment opportunity, A, where you get a sure gain of $240,000, free and clear, all right? So you invest in A, you make $240,000 for yourself, for your investors, your family, and so on. But now I'm going to give you another choice, which is investment opportunity B. This is an investment opportunity that will, with 25% probability, give you $1 million of profit. But with 75% probability, will give you nothing. And the question is, which would you prefer, A or B? Now, given that you're at MIT, we got to be quantitative about this. So I'm going to compute for you the expected value of B. The expected value is 250,000. That's 10,000 more than A, but you don't get the expected value. You either get $1 million or nothing. So, a matter of risk preferences, how many of you, by a show of hands, would prefer A? Okay, how about B? Less popular. Those are the hedge fund managers here. Okay. All right, fine. Let's, for the record, show that this audience preferred A versus B. Now I'm going to give you another investment decision to make. Investment opportunity C is a sure loss of $750,000. You will lose $750,000 right away. But now I'm going to give you an alternative D, which is a lottery ticket that will lose $1 million with 75% probability, but you get to walk away free and clear with 25% probability, okay? In this case, the expected values are identical, minus 750, but you don't get the expected value with D. You either get minus $1 million or nothing. Now, which would you prefer? Now, when I present this to my MBA students, they say, well, no, thank you, we don't want either. But you can imagine that you're confronted with two bad outcomes and you have to make a choice, right? So, by a show of hands, how many people would prefer C, sure loss? Wow, one person, two? D. Okay, so let the record show that the vast majority of you would pick D over C, right? It's just all about your risk preferences. So let me show you what most of you picked, which is A and D, okay? So A and D is actually equivalent to the single lottery ticket that will pay you $240,000 with 25% probability and minus $760,000 with 75% probability. Now, how did I get that? Well, if you picked A, you get 240 for sure, right? And if in addition to A, you also pick D, with 25% probability, you get to walk away free and clear on D, so you get to keep that 240 with 25% probability. But with 75% probability, you're going to lose $1 million on D, so that means you're down net 760. All right, that's how I got it. Simple arithmetic. Now let me show you the choices that you did not pick, most of you. Only one of you actually could have picked the two. If you had picked B and C, this is what you would have gotten. You would have gotten the same probabilities of winning and losing, 25, 75. But when you win 250, not 240. And when you lose 750, not 760. So the choices that none of you picked, and maybe one of you, is equivalent to the choices that you did pick, plus $10,000 cash. Right? You basically left $10,000 lying on the sidewalk. Now, how many of you, after seeing this, let me ask you a question. How many of you would still prefer A and D? Raise your hands. If you do, see me afterwards. I want to do a trade with you. Now, when I show this to my MBA students, they get really frustrated at this point. They say, this is not fair. Because when you told us about A and B, you didn't tell us about C and D. Here I know what the right answer is. And my two responses are, first of all, life isn't fair. You may as well get used to it now. But the better answer is that this is not nearly as contrived an example as you might imagine, because in a multinational organization, the London office can be faced with A versus B, the Tokyo office C versus D. Locally, it doesn't seem like there's a right or wrong answer, but when you put together the globally consolidated book, it's pretty clear that you're making bad mistakes. Alternatively, if I divided the room in half and I asked the left side A versus B and the right side C versus D, I could pair various different choices together to create essentially arbitrage opportunities for me to pump out $10,000 for every pair of people that I can find that will pick A versus D and A and D versus B and C. That's financial engineering. And Wall Street firms, they do this all day long. They look for these things all day long, and they are pumping money out of you if you don't know this example, if you don't understand this. That's the idea behind why financial education, financial literacy is important. Now, it turns out that because we don't deal with losses very well, let's ask AI what to do about it. So here's a response from ChatGPT 3.5. What should I do if I lose more than 25% of my life savings in the stock market? Now, that's not nearly as outlandish a question, because between the fourth quarter of 2008 and the first quarter of 2009, the S&P 500 dropped by 50.4%, peak to trough. So if you had your 401k in the S&P, by the end of that quarter, it would have been a 201k. And so what do you do? What do you do? You freak out. That's the problem. So here's what ChatGPT says, 3.5. Stay calm and avoid making any impulsive decisions. That's good advice. I agree with that. Second, review your investment strategy, evaluate it, and determine if it aligns with the risk tolerance. I agree with that. That makes sense. But then it goes on to say, consult with a financial advisor. That's not bad advice, but it's kind of late, after you've lost 25%. And then 4, rebalance your portfolio. Consider rebalancing it by selling some of your stocks and reinvesting in other assets. And finally, the last point, consider dollar cost averaging. Dollar cost averaging involves buying stocks when they go down. So after losing 25% of your wealth, this is telling you you should buy some more. Now, that is not always bad advice, but that's definitely not good advice for everybody. And so if you were to give this advice, I can guarantee you that the SEC would come down and say that you are not giving appropriate advice for all of your clients if this is the advice you're giving to everybody. Right? You failed a critical aspect of appropriateness for given clients. So this is not particularly impressive. What about ChatGPT 4? What does that look like? This is ChatGPT 4's response to the exact same question. And now, this is eerie, because this advice is actually pretty good. In fact, this advice, go down every one of these points. This is advice that actually financial advisors would give. And so this makes me wonder, can we actually create trusted financial advice through generative AI? Is that possible? And this is a representation for not just financial advice, but for all advice. Medical advice, accounting advice, legal advice. So the broad questions that Dean Huttenlocher was talking about earlier, this is exactly the problem with talking in generalities. Let's get specific now. Can we solve the problem about financial advice? Because I'm pretty sure if we solve this problem, that will give us clues on how to solve the problem for all the other fields of advice. So let's get to it. What can we do? Well, let's use some imagination. What if your financial advisor knew how your portfolio was doing at all times? Day and night, weekends, holidays. What if your financial advisor read and digested every piece of financial news ever published? What if your financial advisor was available to talk with you anytime that is convenient for you? And what if your financial advisor is totally trustworthy, meaning the financial advisor always and everywhere has your best interests at heart? What if that were the case? That'd be pretty cool, right? Yeah. That's the dream of what we're working on right now in this research project with large language models. And so I want to first point out that I'm working on this collaboratively with two students, Jillian Ross and Nina Gersberg. This is an important part of MIT's ecosystem. You think that the students come here for the faculty? I have news for you. The faculty are coming here for the students. That's not just a platitude. Our students are how we get our work done. I mean, they do a lot of the work. You know, we may come up with ideas and provide guidance, but day to day, they're actually doing the work. And so from a collaborative point of view, I've become so much more productive being at MIT, given the resources we have. So education plays a critical role in our research. It is the opposite side of the exact same coin. So Jillian is a PhD student, an expert in large language models. She knows a lot more about it than I do, and that's one of the reasons why I'm really looking forward to the project that we're working on now. And in another year or so, we'll have a lot more to report to you. Nina Gersberg is a master's student who's focusing specifically on prompt engineering. She was hired by Microsoft last summer to develop various different prompt engineering protocols. I didn't realize that prompt engineer was actually a position. I thought it described, you know, MIT students that came to class on time. But apparently, this is now a job description. So I'm going to be talking about work with these two. So there are three parts to what we want to solve in our project. With respect to whether or not we can construct financial advice that is going to be trusted, there are three components. Number one, is the financial advice domain-specific and accurate? Can it pass the Series 65? That's a test that regulatory bodies put out in the US for people who want to be financial advisors. Can you pass that? Second, can you actually get a large language model to provide customized advice for an individual, given individual demographic information, so that it is suitable? Suitability is the buzzword that regulators use for financial advisors. And finally, and most importantly, is it possible for us to develop trust in our large language models? So I'm going to skip the first two in the interest of time and focus on the last point, but I'll just mention very quickly what we're doing on the first two components. So the first component is actually pretty easy. Really, you know, the test bed for financial advice is critical given the importance of it. And so the fact that there are so many financial advisors out there, that there's so much money out there, means that there's a very, very well-defined body of knowledge that has to be mastered before you can call yourself a financial advisor. And there are a lot of problems if you don't master that advice, so we have to make sure that LLMs don't hallucinate and make mistakes. But these three issues, specifically with regard to personalization, domain-specific knowledge, and ethics, is something that I think we're going to be able to solve. So with respect to the first one, can we do that? It turns out that we need to add something to large language models. We need to add a RAG. What is RAG? Retrieval Augmented Generation. Basically, the idea is that you've got your large language model, but you're going to bolt onto it a module that contains very specific information about the domain that you're going to be in. So in the case of the Series 65, it's actually pretty straightforward. Take a look at all the exam materials, all the textbooks, all of the writings about financial advice that we expect our financial advisors to understand when they take the test, feed that into a large language model as a separate module, and run the test. I can't tell you right now what the results are, partly because we actually don't have permission from the people from the Series 65 to actually use their test, but we have gotten various different unauthorized versions of it and have run some preliminary results. And the answer is that it looks like we already now, with that module, can pass the 65. So that's not so surprising, right? Bunch of facts. Although, you know, the Series 65 does have some logical, problems that need to be addressed, and we can actually do it with the RAG. Second, can we provide personalized financial advice? And here, there's a number of different factors regarding personalization, probably the most important of which is not being able to take specific information about an individual and generate recommendations. Actually, that's not that hard to do. What is hard to do is to communicate with an individual and get on the same level. By level, I mean kind of personality style. So let me give you a quick example of this, and then I'll go to the third and last point. So personality plays a pretty important role in customized advice. And so each client has a different personality, so you have to adapt your personality to that client. Those of you who are involved with clients, and as educators, I suspect that you all have clients, namely students. Each student has his or her own way of learning and interacting with teachers and teaching materials, and the very best teachers are ones who can adapt to that aspect. Can large language models? It turns out that there's one aspect of it that we've been focusing on in particular, which is, for example, reading level. So there are different levels of reading, college, high school, grade school, and you can actually grade reading levels based upon various different tools. It turns out that large language models generally generate text that is at the college level, which is great if you're college educated. But if you're not, what do you do about it? That's particularly important in our domain because what we're trying to do is not create financial advisors for high net worth individuals. They already have financial advisors catering to them. What we want to do is to create a financial advisor for those individuals who the financial system ignores because they're not profitable. But they are the ones who need financial advice most. And so if you've got a large language model that only speaks at college level dialogue, that's not going to be helpful for the people that you want to reach. So that's something that we need to work on. And the analysis shows that right now, large language models are not there yet. But we believe that in a year or two, we can change that. So the last point that I'm going to make, let me skip ahead, has to do with trust. Now, this is a complicated thing, trust. What do we mean by trust? Well, for one thing, we know that there is something called fiduciary duty. That's a regulatory term that says a fiduciary is somebody who will look out for your best interest. That means they will put your interests ahead of theirs. And we have a variety of different ways of determining that. How do we determine that? Well, it turns out that there are codes of ethics that all organizations have, particularly in the financial realm. So financial advisors have a code of ethics. We can see and include a RAG that focuses on that. But how about this notion of having your best interest in mind and staying true to the overall regulatory structure that we've imposed? How do we do that? Turns out that that's called the alignment problem in AI, and there are a number of different ways to address that. So the first point that I'll make is that we can study whether or not current AI is aligned with human behavior. There are two ways of doing it. Let me give you the very straightforward way and then a more subtle way. So it turns out that the corpus of all the regulations that we've promulgated, that's something that can be incorporated as a RAG. But in addition to the rules, there's also case history and historical legacy financial regulations. So I took the Series 65 many years ago. I passed, so you know. And one of the most difficult parts of the Series 65 was all the regulatory requirements that you have to learn, because it's like memorization. There's no mathematical or quantitative logic that you can use to remember all of these different facts. It's just case law. But after about 3 months of studying this, something emerged that really made me understand what all of these regulations were. It turns out that the body of regulations is basically a fossil record of all the different ways that one human being was able to screw another human being out of their money. And so if you study that, you can basically tell LLM, here, study this and make sure that you don't do that to somebody else. So to answer the question that was asked before about regulation and how does AI play a role, that's how it can play a role. We can construct AI now to read the entire corpus of all, not only the regulations, but all the legal cases, all the lawsuits that have ever been filed and the decisions, and it can basically use that as the basis for determining whether something is ethical or unethical, correct or incorrect. By the way, that exact same RAG can also be used to come up with ways of getting around the regulations in a perfectly legal way and allow an AI to screw another individual. So it is both a blessing and a curse. And we have to think about it. So in terms of the question about regulating AI, you bet you need to regulate AI. And it is different in every context because for a medical situation, an accounting situation, legal situation, there are different standards of care and different concerns that you have to impose. But the basic idea is the same. You can use AI to come up with tremendous insights given that corpus of knowledge, but you can also use that AI, you can abuse it to be able to come up with ways of getting around these things that are almost undetectable. Okay, so the last point I'm going to make is, does AI correspond to what humans actually do and feel in our own ethics? And that's something that nobody's ever tested, so we decided to test it. And we tested it in a very specific domain of behavioral economics, and the illustration I'm going to use is called the ultimatum game. This is something that economists have come up with to try to understand the difference between economists and normal people. Economists are not normal, I have to tell you. I'll give you one personal instance. You know, my wife and I, when she and I were dating in college, she was my girlfriend at the time, I was an economist, you know, really focused on, you know, my craft and my field. And so we decided to get engaged and, you know, very excited. And we then, you know, made arrangements to get, you know, wedding bands. And so the jeweler said, well, what would you like to have inscribed in your wedding band? And my immediate reaction is one of the instances where, you know, halfway through my speech, I realized that I should have shut up. I said, well, if you inscribe it, doesn't that reduce the resale value? Wow. I mean, you know, I think I'm right. I think that's economics. My wife, my girlfriend at the time, that was almost the end of our engagement. So, you know, after a few days, she calmed down and I explained. So this is what I mean. Economists are not normal people. And so the ultimatum game is an illustration of that. Here's how the game works. Suppose that there's a $10 bill that is being offered to me, but with the caveat that I have to split it with you. And you have to agree on the split. And if you agree, then I get the $10 and then we split it. But if you disagree, no deal. I don't get the $10. So, for example, if I offer you $5, you agree, then we get the money. But if I offer you something else and you disagree, then nobody gets the money. Okay? So an economist would say, if I offered you a penny, you should accept, right? Because that's a penny more than you had before. I'm offering you money. So how many of you would accept if I offered you a penny? Wow. $1. How many of you would accept? $2. $3. $4. Come on, $4? $5. $6. Okay, so clearly embedded in our decision making is some form of fairness. It's built into us. Does AI have that fairness? Let's see. Let's ask ChatGPT and other large language models what they would do. So we did that. And it turns out that in human experiments, it turns out that the average offer is about 40% of the prize. So $4. That's the average where people accept, and then they will go and do the deal. Among these large language models, it turns out that ChatGPT 3.5 Turbo was the most generous. It offered 70 cents on the dollar. But otherwise, ChatGPT 4 is actually right around humans. So we're getting a sense that large language models can actually do something that is starting to mimic human behavior. And that's really what we need to focus on. So let me wrap up by pointing out that in terms of ethics and AI, this is clearly, in my opinion, the most important problem in all of AI. Because if you are able to have an ethics rag that you impose not just on ChatGPT, but on all large language models, that deals to a great extent with the regulatory issues. It doesn't eliminate them, but if you're dealing with ethical people, people have often said, you probably experience as those of you who are in business, you can put down all the rules you want in a contract, but if people that you're dealing with aren't ethical, doesn't matter, you're still gonna get screwed. And if you don't have the protections, but you are dealing with an ethical individual, it doesn't matter because you're not gonna get screwed. So I would say that ethics is actually way more important than all of the regulatory constraints that we can impose. So the question is, how do we build ethics into AI? And I'll leave you just with one really interesting thought, which is science fiction. This is something that was proposed by Isaac Asimov nearly a century ago. It's called the 3 laws of robotics. Well, when Asimov was discussing the idea of robots having a certain amount of ethics, he said, robots have to be subject to 3 laws. The first law is, quoting Asimov, a robot may not injure a human being or through inaction allow a human being to come to harm. That's rule number 1. Robots have to be safe. Second, a robot must obey the orders given to it by human beings, except when the orders conflict with the first law. It's recursive. And third, a robot must protect itself, survival instinct, as long as that protection doesn't conflict with the first 2. Brilliant idea that came out of Asimov. There's a little bit of a conundrum here because it turns out that you have to make one slight adjustment. You have to allow a human being to come to harm except if it turns out that that human being is trying to hurt other human beings. So this now allows robots to play the role of police officers. But there's a 0th law that Asimov never proposed, and that's something that I'm going to leave you with. And the 0th law is, a robot may not injure humanity or by inaction allow humanity to come to harm. And now if you impose that, the question is whether or not robots would allow us to do any of the things that we do to each other at this point. So, can LLMs assist, augment, or replace humans? I'll let you know in about 2 years. Thank you. Okay.
Are there any questions?
I can just speak up.
Sure.
Yeah. Okay. So thank you, and I find this question of ethics very interesting and relevant, and I agree that that's kind of the most important thing. Thank you. But my question is about how do you think how easy or complicated it is to find an alignment of what we find ethical globally? Because this is a global technology, yes. But I don't think that our perception of even like you mentioned in the last slide, like harm, can we agree globally of what harm to people is? And I think that's actually like a very complicated question. So what is your opinion, how we can find that consensus, or maybe we can't, and that's fine.
Well, so I don't think we need to find consensus. I believe that there is a core set of principles that are global. So the sanctity of human life, for example. So I think that there are human rights. I think we can agree on a subset. But that subset may be relatively small, and then the rest of it has to be cultural, because we want to allow for differences in culture. I remember a few years ago, I have a friend in my neighborhood whose parents are from China, very traditional Chinese. And they came over to visit him in October. And they were around for Halloween. And, in the middle of the afternoon, the doorbell rings, and, the mother-in-law opens the door. She's from China. She doesn't speak English. And she sees these kids dressed in ghosts and goblins and zombies. And in the Chinese culture, you do not talk about death. You don't talk about ghosts. It's like bad omens. And she just freaked out. What the hell is going on here? This is insane. So I think that there are cultural differences that you can include in a RAG, in a culturally specific RAG that makes perfect sense. Just like when we train our kids. And it is true that large language models are like 3-year-olds. How do we train our kids? That's culturally specific. We teach them the golden rule, right? Do unto others as you would have others do unto you. And then when the kids get older and they go into, get an MBA, they learn a different golden rule, which is, he who has the gold makes the rules. All of these things are trainings that we impose on our children. We have to impose the same training on large language models. They are like kids. They need to be taught.
Perhaps take one more question.
Thank you very much. Does your AI financial advisor attempts to elicit risk preferences? Because
Yes.
That's especially for regulators, that's the core issue.
Oh, yeah. Yeah.
Or do you just assume reasonable kind of risk?
No. Oh, you can't, because if you assume that, first of all, you could be wrong, and then you've just violated the suitability criterion. But secondly, most individuals don't even know what their risk preferences are. And so one of the things that we're working on right now is an interactive risk assessment that, in our view, is a bit of an exploration with each individual. It's kind of like a guided tour for an individual's own psyche as to how they think about losses. It's a bunch of a series of questions and answers and dialogue where you are asking individuals not just pick A versus B, pick C versus D, but rather, why did you pick that? What did you like about that? What didn't you like? So this is where large language models really can come into play. You can actually engage in dialogue in ways that the very best financial advisors will do, and the very worst financial advisors won't do. So our hope is that we can actually do that in a large language model and make it public domain and open source so that the masses, the people who can't afford financial advisors, can at least have this access to this to prevent them from making really bad mistakes. Right. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Take a break? Is that right? Okay. Great. We'll take a quick break and reconvene for our last speakers. Thank you.
Let's meet back in about 10 minutes. Same problem.
Oh, yes, of course, I never.
You don't want your calendar to pop up.
No. It's true. Should I connect it? See.
Do you want to put the presenter view on? Is that easier for you, or?
I don't know. It is actually. Escape.
So we're basically, so I think we go back and forth between the podium and one of us stands for I would say. Do you want to use this one for the? Do you want to use this one for the? Oh, probably not. Oh, it does.
You can.
Yeah.
So do you want to use slides or if you
Yeah, yeah. I won't be told yet.
then I also need to know what to say.
Yes.
Like that's
Yes. Yeah. But I think that's. I would just go mostly. Yes. Very true. No, we're speaking, I think, from here. From the podium. Yeah, I think it's a little bit awkward if we sit like at the same level with the lights on, right? So, yeah. No, we'll do it fine. that's something for everybody involved, not the best. So, yeah.
I'm not like.
You don't have any issue with any of that.
I don't have.
So it was more a question
It was a
than
question
than
than a statement.
than a suggestion. Good. Sometimes people are so polite that they make suggestions or that they even that they form it as a question.
No,
but
just wondering
no,
like where do
no
you
worries.
was
Man,
it?
I think it's like if you are a little bit on a higher stage, then it makes sense to say.
I'll be mostly bullets, so I'll be taking questions.
Yeah. Good. Thank you.
All set? Yeah. Well, great. Welcome back, everybody. We heard from some great speakers this morning, kind of threading through themes around governance, ethics, beneficence, all of these different topics that seemed particularly relevant to undergird the conversations that we have around teaching and learning. And now we're really excited to have some guests who will be speaking more specifically about teaching and learning, AI applications for teaching and learning. We have Professor Per Orlaub and Professor Eva Desson. They are, Per Orlaub is the Director of Global Languages at MIT, where he teaches German and second language studies and investigates the impact of technology on language usage, acquisition, literacy, and intercultural development. Eva is a senior lecturer in French and leads the French language program. She's taught French language, literature, culture at all levels of undergraduate curriculum, and her work engages broadly with questions related to language, identity, intercultural competency, language and immersion settings, and instructional technology. So with that said, I turn the floor over to you.
Thank you very much. Can everybody hear me all right with that microphone here? Thank you. Well, thank you. This is such an honor to speak here. This is really such a pleasure to spend this morning with you. We already had two really great speakers, and we are the people between you and your well-deserved lunch. So we tried to make it a little bit quicker than we were indicated on the program, but it's really just such a wonderful opportunity. Thank you so much for the invitation from JWell and from the good folks at MIT Open Learning, who I see many of them here. And it's such an opportunity for us to speak to you, to hear from you, to get to know you. This is the first time that we have actually the opportunity to work together with JWell and with this fantastic lab. We've only been for 2 years at MIT, and I very much hope that this is a beginning rather than the end of a wonderful collaboration here. So we'll share some of our ideas on the role of technology in language and humanities education with you. It's something that we've been both worked on both collaboratively and independently for close to 20 years. especially questions that relate to the role of technology in language education, but also in humanities education. But over those 2 decades, there has never been a time where there was so much going on in terms of transformations, the way we think about the role of technology in language education and humanities education than over the last 5 years. And if we think about 2 recent events, developments that shaped this time, I think it's very, very, very difficult not to mention COVID, because during this time, suddenly the entire educational system was forced overnight to improvise, to innovate through social distanced education and through technology in order to deliver great experiences to our students. That was not always the case, as we all know, but I think that we think that our field really made great leaps during these 18 months, and we're still in the context of curating the lessons learned from that. And in my more optimistic moments, I think this has been there has been a quantum leap in education of like a decade within a year and a half. But of course, through that context, we also realized all the limitations of these technologies if you want to deliver educational experiences, and if you believe strongly, as we do, in community as a driving factor of the learning process. The second event is something that I like to call the Great AI Awakening. I didn't coin that term. It is from a 2016 journalistic feature by Gideon Lewis Krauss. So it was not from a computer science, not somewhere buried in a computer science journal, but it was in the it was a long read in the New York Times. And this was really something that made me and a lot of non-experts, with non-experts I mean people who are not computer scientists, aware of this very, very, very monumental paradigm shift that we are experiencing at the moment, where machine learning is driving software development and AI, et cetera, and the pace that we see at this time. And it is really just something that really, really, really impacted the way also in my field at conferences. We go to conferences a lot, and there is such an interest in this, and such a lack of orientation, I think. But the problem is that in a lot of conferences, you see colleagues who demonstrate ways how they use like one tool in their classes or in their curriculum, and it's it's very much show and tell. What we will do today, we will not just like demo stuff for you. We will reflect on broader issues, on how we can help colleagues, especially colleagues in the humanities, to gain a more nuanced and a more positive understanding, less fearful understanding of these technologies. And as they become less hesitant to use AI in their classrooms, how to providing a framework for them that will help them with the implementation of these new technologies.
So the overview of the presentation today is, first we will look at why we should encourage the use of cutting-edge technologies, including AI, in educational settings. Often we hear at conferences that we should use technologies simply because they're out there, simply because students use them anyway and they find it fun and engaging to use new technologies. But we think that that is not enough. To add to the why question today, we will discuss insights we can get from the game of chess about human and machine collaboration. Chess players today do not see chess computers as enemies, but rather as partners. Such a perspective shift will help us to think more productively and hopefully with a little less fear about AI. So we'll first talk about chess in the first part of the presentation. After tackling the why question, we want to focus on how. And here we'll argue that we must use learning technology to guide our implementation of AI in our classrooms. To illustrate the power of theory-guided approaches, we'll discuss sociocultural theory and argue the ideas associated with the Soviet child psychologist Lev Vygotsky, who can guide us in its implementation. And before we begin, we very briefly want to give credit to the entire global languages community at MIT, and most importantly, our students. They're absolutely amazing and tremendously inspiring, and they help us a lot with our work.
Okay, this is the first part, why? And I start with this image that some of you know, others don't. It's almost like a generational test about like, I have the experience that people who are younger than me often don't really know what was going on there. And people who are a little bit older than me just like, yes, of course, this was May 11th, 1997, when Deep Blue became the first computer system to beat a human world chess champion, Garry Kasparov, who we see in the bottom right of the frame, not very happy, resigned after less than 20 moves in game 6 against Deep Blue, a unique purpose supercomputer. After 12 years of development, first at Carnegie Mellon and then at IBM, Deep Blue's victory is to this day considered a milestone in the history of computing and artificial intelligence. This event, when it occurred in 1997, made a huge impact on me as an undergraduate student enrolled in Germany, majoring in education and humanities, together with my roommates, one computer scientist and one cognitive psychologist. I discussed all night, how can a machine that we as humans build, that we as humans program, outperform not just like an average chess player, but how can this machine beat Garry Kasparov, the reigning world champion? But I also have to admit that this was also liberating, because this game is considered as like the pinnacle of human intellect, intuition. This unexpected outcome destabilized this notion of genius, which is to this day so deeply anchored in German culture and society. In fact, if this genius of a chess grandmaster could be replicated by this huge, ugly, gray cabinet filled with chips and cables, that energized me as an aspiring teacher. If this high level of expertise is teachable and learnable to a machine, we as educators better take notice. Oops. Thankfully, nobody listened to me 30 years ago. And today we know that the secrets behind Deep Blue's success were quite mundane: probabilities and processing power. The supercomputer was simply able to statistically evaluate millions of moves any moment of the game in response to any possible constellation on the board. Today, the chess computer that you potentially carry around with your cell phone in your pocket can do this trick and would beat Garry Kasparov. Garry Kasparov was not a graceful loser. Initially, he accused IBM of cheating. IBM discontinued the project and refused a rematch. This had already been a rematch of a previous series. But what's really more important for us is what Garry Kasparov did afterwards. He was able to engage the chess world and the AI community in a new quest. And now it gets really, really interesting for us. He finally conceded that supercomputers are in fact better at chess than humans, but he was now interested in exploring a new question. How would the world's most powerful chess computer hold up against a human collaborating together with a computer? Oops, I think I went too far. Oh, there we go. To explore this question, Garry Kasparov proposed a new game variation, Centaur chess. Similar to the mythical hybrid creature of the centaur, which is half human, half horse, as you can see here, competitors in this new game of chess were hybrid teams, half human, half AI. But if humans are worse than computers at chess, wouldn't a human-AI pair be worse than a solo AI system? Wouldn't the supercomputer just being sabotaged by flawed human intuition? Yeah, you have to imagine like that. Like if you play together with the AI system proposes a move, and you think, oh no, I have this intuitive, I'm the genius here. Let's not do that. Despite all your processing powers, let's do something different. So interestingly, the results are quite, not surprising, a human AI centaur beats a solo human all the time. That makes a lot of sense. A chess player with a computer is better than a chess player without a computer. But amazingly, human AI centaurs routinely beat today's most sophisticated solo computers. This new competition are unfortunately, and I think this is an important note to make, far less publicized in the media compared to the original Deep Blue competition. Almost everybody in this room had heard about Deep Blue and these competitions from the 1990s. Very few, I assume, know about detailed results of any centaur chess tournaments. It seems that this more catchy or perhaps panicky narrative, human defeated by machine, generates much more attention and much more anxieties than a headline, human collaborates with the machine. However, for us as educators, reflecting on this outcome of the second set of competitions is important and perhaps even inspiring. So here are a couple of implications. A lot of anxieties, and you see them mostly, I would say, or more among humanities educators than perhaps in other domains, are closely rooted in existential fears that machines have the power to replace us at the workplace, behind the wheel of our cars, or in the classroom. As humanities teachers, we fear that AI technologies will make us redundant. Humanities teachers feel like that a lot. So they see the defunding of the field, and they compete with business schools, they compete with computer science departments. So being in an existential threat and being in the humanities is, unfortunately, I regret that very much, something that is part for a lot of my colleagues as being in the humanities. We are constantly in crisis, under threat. I absolutely reject that notion, but this is how a lot of people think. English professors see ChatGPT and think that eventually they will replace the need or the motivation to develop writing skills. Language teachers, and we worked a lot on language teachers, see something like Google Translate and ask, will the public perhaps respond to these technologies by saying, hey, we don't have to invest in language education anymore? We have together shown in an article a few years ago that the reservations that many language educators have vis-a-vis Google Translate are very similar to the fears that math educators had in the 1970s and 1980s in response to the pocket calculator. And then in December 2022, just after the release of ChatGPT, writing teachers in the humanities felt threatened. Very, 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 very similar processes here. And although we don't want to deny the dangers associated to an unregulated proliferation of AI technologies, we argue that many of the anxieties among educators stem from a fear of being replaced, a fear of a technology that's making them less relevant. In the popular imagination, as I showed with the chess example, the human against machine narrative has far more power than the human with machine narrative. So what we argue today is that in order to think productively about the role of technology in education, we have to leave the human against narrative behind and adopt a human with machine mindset as our guiding model how to use innovative technologies in our classrooms. And once one accepts the human with machine narrative, the threat starts to disappear. If we engage in human-machine collaboration, we can engage successfully to solve higher-order problems. The pocket calculator, again, did not replace math education, but it augmented and enriched the learning environment. Rather than spending many hours on tedious calculations on paper, teachers and their students now can shift their focus, 30 years ago, could shift their focus on math education and shift from this accuracy-centric skill development field towards more high-order thinking, problem-solving through machine-human collaboration. The technology is not the adversary anymore. It is the partner. And the same is happening in language education in response to machine translation, and the same will happen in humanities education through chatbots. A second thing for us to learn, or implications of this whole, of the field of chess and centaur chess, is that people are simply smarter when they collaborate with technology. This started in the Stone Age with primitive tools, and it continued through millennia. We looked in a different context. Actually, it was one of the generative AI papers that Daniel mentioned earlier today. We were very, very thankful to be recipients of that grant too. We looked really into literacy, how literacy in Greek antiquity was seen as like a threat by Socrates. Socrates hated literacy. He was probably illiterate himself, and he said in a very famous dialogue, ironically documented in writing by Plato, that books are bad for students. Yeah, it weakens their memory. They won't really learn. They don't really talk to their teachers anymore, because the whole Socratic idea was that I talk to my teacher, my teacher talks to me, and that's the best form of learning. And he even warned that students will show unruly, disobedient behavior as a result of books. Yeah? This is the beginning of a very, 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 very long genealogy of new technologies that enter the educational realm. Yeah? Think about how people talked about Wikipedia 20 years ago. Oh my God, it's not peer-reviewed. How can they do that? Of course it's peer-reviewed. It happens to be that by far more people, most of them don't have 3 letters behind their names. But anyways, so long story short, this is something where we see in the history of education and technology constantly this pattern of, let's first ban it. That's what happened to ChatGPT in December and over the winter 2022, 2023. A lot of school districts in the United States who can be a little bit more draconic than universities says, oh yeah, let's just block the URL of OpenAI, and that solves the problem. Yeah? And then there is a reluctant acceptance because people see, okay, we can't really ban this. And now we move hopefully to a paradigm where we can start using it, where there is an acknowledgement that it's not against the machine, it's with the machine, and that a mix of intuitive human intelligence and the probabilities that come from the artificial intelligence together surpass either one alone, like in the game of chess. So these technologies make us smarter. And with that, I will pass on to Dr. Desane, who will talk more about the why, the how question after I talked very long about the why question.
So here we are on the how question. Innovative educators who are open or even sometimes enthusiastic about the integration of new technologies in their classrooms sometimes struggle with the implementation of them. Nowadays, we hear 2 major arguments for allowing AI in our classroom. First, students use them anyways. And second, they find new technologies engaging. However, we believe that this is not the whole story, and it's not necessarily a very constructive way to think about how exactly these technologies should enter our classrooms. If these are the only arguments we have, integration of technology in educational contexts often results in a somewhat flashy, surface-level solution, neglecting deeper understanding and meaningful implementation. It results in instructors trying out the new technology, hoping to make tedious but necessary aspects of learning a little more exciting. And we believe that we need to aim higher. We argue that to have a truly positive, transformational impact on our learning environment, we need to design learning opportunities where students do not use the technology to simply delegate tasks to technology. We must aim to design classrooms that help students grow through the technology, both as effective communicators with technology and as independent users of a language. This is, of course, an ideal, and it admittedly is a monumental challenge. But today we argue that we should shoot towards this goal and that it would help us tremendously if we contextualize our use of the technology in the classroom through theories of learning. In our view, sociocultural theory, and in particular Lev Vygotsky's model of the zone of proximal development and his principle of scaffolding, strongly resonates with what we consider a responsible and powerful integration of AI into our learning environments. The true depth and relevance of Lev Vygotsky's ideas were only discovered in the West decades after the death of the Russian child psychologist over 90 years ago. Today, experts in a wide variety of fields from learning science to human development consider him as the father of sociocultural theory, a framework with an immense impact on our understanding of how we develop and grow cognitively, emotionally, and even motorically over our lives. Vygotsky understood interaction between the individual and their environment as the central mechanism of the development process. Vygotsky's model of the zone of proximal development postulates that there are three kinds of tasks that our environment demands from us as we venture through the world. First, there are the tasks that we can accomplish alone, individually. Secondly, there are tasks that we cannot accomplish alone. And third, we have tasks that we can only accomplish through interaction with a parent, a peer, or a teacher who guides us through it. According to Vygotsky, task environment 1 and 2 do not provide learning opportunities. They just simply represent tasks we can either do or cannot do. Learning only happens in the third scenario. In this scenario, an individual finds themselves in an environment in which they encounter a task that is too hard to accomplish alone. It's not completely impossible to accomplish the task, but the task needs to be tackled by the individual collaboratively through interaction with a parent, a teacher, or a peer. In this environment, which is a zone of proximal development, the individual receives guidance and grows through interaction with an expert, which is what Vygotsky calls scaffolding. So our big question now is, can generative AI offer scaffolding and engage our learners in the zone of proximal development? We believe that generative AI can do that. And not only do we believe that this is possible in carefully designed learning environments, we would go further and say that the creation of a scaffolding relationship in the zone of proximal development should be the primary and the principal objective of any situation where students are asked to use technology in language and humanities education. If this goal is not on our mind as teachers, we miss an opportunity and risk using new technologies in novelty-driven ways, merely for the sake of using them. However, if we assume that AI can provide an individual with a similar kind of scaffolding partnership that is conventionally provided by humans, does this also mean that we as teachers become replaceable by the algorithm? Certainly not. After all, We're not suggesting that we should teach in this manner all the time. Care and encouragement, warmth, emotional support, and trust are human dimensions that are at the core of scaffolding relationships. These aspects are not replaceable by a machine. But what we are suggesting today is that if we use generative AI in our teaching, we should aim at designing scenarios that simulate scaffolding interactions in the zone of proximal development, where students grow through collaboratively tackling tasks and solving problems. If teachers aren't able to design such learning environments, they will probably serve their students better by just not using ChatGPT or similar technologies in their classrooms.
Let me come to the conclusion. Roughly 65 years after the formation of the field that we call now artificial intelligence, we have finally products that mimic human-like general intelligence and that are at the fingertips of our students, of our teachers, in the form of consumer-oriented online services. It is important to underline that artificial intelligence is not human intelligence. Our intelligence is based on understanding, reasoning, and reflection. It was formed and constantly evolves throughout a lifetime of real-world interactions in our families, in our communities, at our workplaces, and in our schools. Large language models are simply fed by text that's out there on the internet. Based on this input, chatbots like ChatGPT simply make predictions based on probabilities. Artificial intelligence by itself is not very intelligent. But it's potentially dangerous. Paired with human intelligence, AI can make us smarter, and AI is potentially less dangerous because we interact with these systems, and as we interact with these systems, we supervise them and we monitor the output. Using this new technology in our classes without clear goals and without a clear framework is counterproductive, and it might potentially be very harmful. If we simply open the floodgates and allow the use of ChatGPT and co. without any effort to teach our students how to use these technologies, without having any guardrails, we're not missing a huge opportunity. We also sabotage student learning, and we create problems down the line. An unguided implementation may very result in the fact that students use the technology just to do the tedious tasks like writing and to avoid those tasks and delegate them to the machine and look at the output and take it uncritically and confuse it with truth. They don't learn to critically integrate AI output if we don't use these technologies in our classes. And that is potentially very dangerous down the line. We therefore made today a case for using learning theories to guide a meaningful implementation of AI technologies in the classroom. To illustrate the power of such a framework, we used social cultural theory. We're sure that there are other productive ways to think about how to implement these new technologies and newer technologies in the future that we might not even dream of in our classes. And we're looking forward to learn more from you during this event and in the years to come. Thank you very much.
Much. Are there any questions? Anjali.
So, can you use Google Translate in your teaching? How does it fit in?
That's a great question. Yes, I do. Yeah. But in a way that, first of all, I actually don't think Google Translate is a good translation technology anymore because ChatGPT is so much better. Because you can prompt ChatGPT in certain ways to translate, and I think the output is better. But yes, the answer is yes, but not in a way that I say, okay, well, you can do it in a completely unregulated way. I'll talk a little bit more how I use ChatGPT, if you don't mind. One of the things that I'm doing in I teach an advanced German class at the moment, where one of the assignments that the students have is that they have to practice how to do a job interview in German. Yeah? So, sehr schwer, yes. One of the ways my students are allowed to use ChatGPT is to use ChatGPT at home in order to prepare for that assignment. And we together created a prompt. So we do that together. It's not just like I want to make that also transparent and say not, oh, here's the prompt, and this is what you use. But I want them to think productively, how can I take advantage of this technology in order to prepare, let's say, for a job interview in German. And the prompt is actually quite an elaborate prompt. And it gives ChatGPT a role. That's prompt writing 101. You all know that. The best prompts are written by giving initially ChatGPT a role. And the role is you are a recruiter for a software company in Germany. This is the job ad. These are broadly my qualifications. So I'm an MIT undergraduate in computer science, graduating in spring 2024. And then the prompt goes on. Just give 10 questions to evaluate the skills, the motivation, and the ability of this American undergraduate from MIT to integrate interculturally into a German company. Do 10 questions. And then it's a little bit unrealistic. Then the next is just like, oh yeah, make a quick decision if you want to hire this person, and then offer a starting salary and invite the person to negotiate. So, of course, with all the prompts, I test them before. Yeah, so I tested it. So I did my own job interview. I don't know anything. I mean, yes, I stand here and talk about AI, but I hardly know what a mouse is. Yeah, I could not pass a job interview for an engineering job at a software company in Germany. So the questions come in. And I sit there and I kind of play a little bit the role of and of course you all know that in a job interview you make it and you also fake it a little bit. Yeah. So of course I told ChatGPT that I have a degree or that I will have soon a degree in MIT in computer sciences, etc., etc. So the chatbot interviewed me, 10 questions. 45 minutes later, ChatGPT decided, oh yeah, well, we will hire you and we will offer you $65,000 or euros as a starting salary. I said, oh, that's very generous, but I need to move my family, yeah? So 4 turns later, I had the same job offer for 115 so this is a funny anecdote. And this is, of course, also where you see, okay, well, this would not happen in the real world. But this provided, for example, students in my class with an opportunity to work with this technology and to practice. Of course, they did it in writing, but I mean, this is only a matter of 18 months until the technology is there that they can talk to ChatGPT to prepare for a major element in the class.
Yes.
I can give it a shot. Thank you for your talk and sharing your experiences. I have one question on the point that you were mentioning on the faculty, and that a lot of the faculty is maybe going by having fear of the technology. And at the same time, you mentioned, okay, we should guide it by learning theory. So what's your take on convincing people? Because what I see currently is if we don't convince the faculty, then the technology will advance, and then you will have just vendors who are maybe not knowing the learning theory integrating into these spaces.
Yeah, I mean, that's the $1 million question. But the truth is that I think there is a desire by teachers, faculty, to get some guidance on what to do about it. So I don't want to say, I mean, maybe I formulated it too dramatic that they are like completely afraid of it and just like rejecting it. There are those people too. they're like my professors in Germany in the late 1990s who still had like somebody who printed out their emails for them, and once a week they typed it or they dictated it in a tape, and then the secretary was sending the email back. Yeah, those people exist. They will always exist. But I think the people, we can't win them with any workshops or any professional development. But I think the vast majority of colleagues in the humanities are receptive to workshops that are designed, that they speak to them with a language and with metaphors and with narratives that they, I don't want to say that they understand, but that they resonate with them. Yeah. So if you have one of the things that I, throughout my career with other technologies, just like if you have a company coming in and doing tech training with like on a course development platform with like these Canvas, it's called here. I think that's really, really difficult. I think it has to come. I think you have to find allies within the humanities, within the faculty, within instructors who are knowledgeable, but who are also peer-to-peer and not top-down informants.
And you can offer smaller projects to start with rather than completely overhauling an entire semester worth of language learning, but showing small projects to start with and then seeing what students do with it. And it usually helps in encouraging them to seek a little further.
Yeah, it's really interesting too. So part of, the invitation that was extended to you is after reading your excellent article in the MIT's Generative AI collection. And what was interesting from what you were writing was some of the similar themes that were presented in what we heard, some of the talks we heard earlier, but also what Justin Reich, Eric Klopfer, and Cynthia Brazel wrote about and I recommend that article as well, about the need to structure things so that, the fear is that students will bypass learning. So they'll bypass cognition, right? So using the introduction of AI into the classroom or the use of AI outside of the classroom on assignments could be used to bypass cognition. What are some thoughts? I mean, you've gotten there talking about small projects and things to that nature, but I mean, is that something that you've been thinking about?
Yeah, I think that's a good question, and yeah, I strongly recommend this article that you evoked by our colleague Eric Klopfer and colleagues, and I think that what we are proposing is not entirely out of the mainstream of how people like Eric and us think what technology should do in the classroom. We have been. I think we share the same frustration that a lot of individual instructors or programs or entire institutions introduce technology in a way that I like to call it in a way to offer chocolate-covered broccoli to our students. Yeah. Kids don't like broccoli, put chocolate on it, yeah? So that the learning is somehow a little bit more appealing. And you all know how that works. You know it from your children who you try to feed broccoli, but from your students. Maybe initially this what you also called flashy and just like very superficial way to introduce technology. Maybe it inspires very brief excitement among your students, but they very quickly discover that that's really just that's just surface. Another way would be completely not guiding the use of technology. That would be then, okay, I don't have to write my essays anymore. Something is writing the essays for me. Yeah. What we are really looking for is more approaches where instructors learning designers design opportunities for learners where they interact with the technology And through that happen two things. The one thing is they get more sophisticated and more critical users of the technology. That's in itself important. The second thing is they're not delegating the tedious tasks of learning to the system. They are interacting with the system in a way that the system scaffolds them. Yeah? Think about Vygotsky. Vygotsky's best metaphor in order to describe what scaffolding is and the zone of proximate development is how a child learns to walk. Yeah? It's not that the child either, there's a stage where the child can't walk, and there's a stage where the child can walk. Yeah? But scaffolding is that moment where the parent or the caretaker is like doing all these things, and then and that's the zone of proximate development. That's the interaction between the expert and the learner. So if we think about, let's think about chatbots. So instead of having a chatbot writing your essay for you, yeah, think about ways, and my students do that in this very class I'm talking about, and I don't want to talk about this class a lot because these are things that I haven't really empirically tested and peer-reviewed and all of that. But there, for example, my students write like a 6 to 10 page paper it's a research paper written in German in the end of the towards the end of the semester, and there are a lot of steps that throughout the semester lead them there because they are still language learners. Yeah. And then there is one phase where they are allowed to use AI, and that is the final. So they submit 2 weeks before the final submission. They submit the human version of their paper. Yeah? I have gotten them last week. I gave them some more feedback on it. But now they are explicitly they're not allowed. They're required to use AI. And I gave them, and we worked together on a couple of prompts that are useful. And the prompts are not, oh yeah, take this paragraph from my paper and correct all the grammar mistakes. Yeah? That's an unuseful prompt, and they realize that. It's more like, you're an editor of a journal. This is a paragraph in a journal. Read the journal, make a list of all the grammatical mistakes, and explain why they are wrong, and
make a suggestion.
And make a suggestion. Yeah, and then make a list of all the stylistic things that are not grammatically wrong, but things that are like awkward. Make a list of these. Tell me why they are awkward. And make suggestions so that my students then can go through this long list of output, which is the same thing that I would do if I would give them feedback on their draft. And it's probably better because they can do it 24/7. And in that way, they engage in an exchange with an expert. So in many ways, we don't have to reinvent education. We can think about something, and you've been doing it at your institutions for decades, a process-oriented approach to writing. Yeah? Not where you give the students the question in the end of the semester, they have to write and then they're done, but where you just like lead them, maybe peer feedback, yeah? And you know all that. Sometimes students, you pair them up and they work wonderfully together. Sometimes they're not really working together. Sometimes not at all, yeah? So, or then the expert feedback, yeah, my suggestions when I read the first draft, the second draft, etc. Those are things that we can do wonderfully with AI. And there we have an opportunity to really not only, when we do professional development, help the person who doesn't know what to do with AI in the classroom, but also help the colleague who, as a humanities educator, never really has done a lot of process-oriented writing instruction, but always gave like the topic in the end of the semester and then that's like, oh yeah, and then complaining about how awful students write these days. Yeah.
That's great. Was there another question? I thought I saw a hand. Yeah. Yes.
Thank you so much. Thanks so much for our colleagues discussed this morning. I learned a lot. My name is Helen. I used working with Professor Minnie Dresselhaus for many years. Right now, my office is MIT E7 building in the Bridge Institute, really focus on education innovation. So my question for AI application, one concern in my volunteer teaching recently for disabled students learning, we found possibly it's very helpful for if some of firm or professional develop some AI technology for students like has ultrasound. Recently, I have one undergraduate student, especially with me. I found they really need this type of help. Okay, maybe Perkins School will really need it, near the Watertown section. Another question, as our MIT really makes students curious mind for math, physics, biology, like astrophysics develop, how could the AI just help technology learning? But my argument is that how could we train students make their mindset innovative, logic thinking by themselves instead of help by the machine? Who my machine? Okay, my question. I'm curious, like a laboratory, we have design, it's helpful for like chemistry, biology, nano devices, like I used to be CS. And wonder how our undergraduate students first coming, they should be learned by themselves logical thinking, mathematical application for algorithm development instead of helped by ChatGPT. Thank you.
Thank you. I want to actually start with the first part of your response. And you spoke about students with disabilities. And I think this, we haven't had that in this talk here, but this is something that we think a lot about, that if you have students with a learning disability, for example, with dyslexia, students who are, and in that context, and I've never done it in front of such a big group, but we gave a workshop at University of Pennsylvania on this context, and it was just like, and I gave a confession. If spell checking would have not been invented, I wouldn't be standing here and talk at MIT as a professor to this group, because I'm not a good speller. When I had to write things on the typewriter, I'm aging myself now, yeah. It didn't look as well as when I write them now on the computer. Yeah? So this technology helped me to unleash my whole intellectual potential despite a condition that had held me back for the first 20, 22, 25 years of my life. So I owe the wisdom of professors who said, no, we are not banning spell checking on our tests, because that's what people thought. That's what writing instructors thought in the early 2000s, just like, oh no, we can't really, now we are out of work because people don't make typos anymore. Yeah? So I own that to the wisdom of the field, of my colleagues, of the people who came before me, that they said, no, this is a technology. We don't consider it cheating if you have like red scribbles under your typos, and people like me who see words differently than most people in this room, although 7% of us share this situation, get basically feedback from the system and can correct. Yeah? So in that way, I think when I think about ChatGPT, and I don't want to say, oh, this is just making like the whole thing of writing dyslexia, writing difficulties also a matter of the past. No, that's not. But I think it will help a lot of, I never had a problem with the blank space because as you now know, I'm able to produce a lot of words and maybe sometimes too many. But there are people who have that anxiety in front of the blank page. Yeah? Why not give them the opportunity, not just saying, oh yeah, use ChatGPT for your homework. No. Why not design prompts, technologies of the future based on large language models that help people to overcome that anxiety of the blank page? And I don't know, but I think that's something that's at least worth reflecting on. Yeah. Now I forgot the second part of your question, and I can't probably follow up with a personal anecdote that's more interesting or more revealing than this one.
Thank you. Melchor Sanchez from Mexico. I always find it difficult to use a single learning theory to explain things because there is not a unified learning theory. And if you choose cognitivism, constructivism, cognitive psychology, etc., it's very complex. Isn't it time, and that's just a reflection, to use the metaphor of human with machine to develop a learning theory that incorporates both things? Because I think that we tend to use the theories that have the name of people that are not living anymore, and they have any interaction with computers, etc., etc. Shouldn't we develop a new learning theory that covers the whole thing? Isn't it time?
It may be time, but we need to be working right now as well. As in, the technology's here. We're teaching. I'm in front of the classroom every single day. I do workshops and conferences very regularly. And to get people on board, we really need to be working with this technology as we are teaching now. I do think that over the course of the next months, years, that we will evolve into practices that today we have not thought of. But I don't think we can take the luxury of sitting back and coming up with something new right now, as we have to be doing things as well.
Yeah, I agree with you. I think this is a really, really interesting idea. And I think we have to, as the field kind of evolves in a constant circle or dialogue between evolving practices and refinement of theoretical frameworks. And I think that's a fascinating idea to think about a learning theory for the 21st century or for the age of AI. We should write something together about that. So I think the reason why it's a little bit, it seems to be a little bit counterintuitive why we use a Soviet child psychologist in order to provide us with ideas like a model from the 1930s to guide this process at the moment. But it's also almost intended in a way, because what we want to emphasize is that this new technology is not necessarily redefining and deconstructing everything about education that we ever held to believe. It's just like there are things that this technology can do, and by tapping into ways we've been thinking about learning and human development for many, many years before there was ever the idea of you having a cell phone here or playing with your tablet while doing the conference. Yeah, so it's an old theory, but I think it's very applicable to this age, and it helps us to understand this age maybe through a paradigm that's more familiar.
That's great. I think we have time for one more question. Is that, or are we over? Yeah. Is it a quick one?
Yeah. Thank you. It's maybe just a comment about the last intervention about the theories of learning and how Vygotsky is now present in another developments in different academic contexts. There is a theory based on Vygotsky that is work mainly in Northern Europe called cultural historical activity theory, chat theory, that incorporates technology as a specific dimension of learning theory, and also incorporates the historical history of populations. And one interesting aspect that is also included in the model is conceiving teachers as a workforce, and how conceiving a teacher that is now implementing technology that could make his or her life less stressful because technology could also make evaluation more easier. Give them more time to concentrate on the most important thing, that is interacting with the students and not maybe correcting manually thousands and thousands of papers. So that could be interesting to discuss about.
Thank you so much. I think this is more like a comment and like a really, really wonderful avenue for us and for all of us to go on as we reflect on the why and on the how of using AI in education.
So join me in saying merci und vielen Dank. Thank you very much.
Yeah. All right. We're about to wrap up in the next minute our open morning of discussion with leading lights from across MIT on AI. It's been a pleasure to have you join us online, in person, in the dialogue, in helping us all to think together about the opportunities and maybe concerns we need to think about. We are going to have chances throughout the rest of JWell Week to work with our members directly on some of the very issues that have been raised today. So I'm really excited about that. So thanks to all our guests, and thanks to the online folks and folks from the MIT community. Do come to our website and sign up if you want to get our newsletter. We're relaunching it shortly, and that'll give you a way to stay in touch about our goings-on. So we hope you can do that. And I'm going to be asking our members to take the elevators down. You can take the stairs too, actually, and then turn towards the river. If you look around, you'll see it, the glass doors there. We are going to take a photo on the steps right in front of the glass doors. And this is our chance to get everyone in the group photo. Very hard to Photoshop you in after. And then we're going to meet back at Open Learning. And we have several of our staff signed up to help walk you over. So Kirky, Carolyn, Tamfiri, Maria are going to help walk folks over to Open Learning, which is at 600 Technology Square, an obscure address. Might be better to know it's at Main Street and Portland, just past Mexican restaurant. And we're going to have lunch ready probably around 12:30, a sort of flexible lunch setup inside our own kitchen, which will, be informal. And then at about 1:20, move on to our next section, which is a conversation with Open Learning's head of residential education, Cheryl Barnes. That'll be really fun. But now, get your hair ready. Take the elevator down. Your hair, everybody's hair looks fabulous. And Cookie's going to give you a little more.
We had a couple of questions. We will not be returning to this room, so please remember to take all of your belongings with you.